Hello, viewer. I want to talk a little bit about police reform, which, yes, it's related to current events, but I'm not going to talk about it in the sense of news, because I actually think police reform is necessary across the West. Not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, even though we don't have nearly the same problems as the United States has in terms of police brutality and violence and so on. Firstly, police brutality in the United States tends to be very specifically an ethnic question because certain ethnic groups are more violent than others. Just look up the black on black crime statistics in Chicago on any given week. Which is a problem we don't quite have in Europe yet, because immigration trends being what they are, we always follow what the United States does. So eventually, we're going to end up pretty much in the same place. But the bigger issue, I think, is that, and there's a video which I can't find anymore, but it was made either by the distributist Sean Last or Old Hype. I can't remember which one of them, and I can't seem to find the video. But this video discussed community policing versus responsive policing. And if you're not subscribed to these three people, you should, because they're very interesting. They're more data driven and so on, and they're a little bit more academic YouTubers. They're interesting to follow. But the idea of community policing versus responsive policing was something that's been developing since the 1970s. And what they said was basically in the past, police officers would live in a neighborhood they patrolled, and they'd be a community police officer. They'd have a neighborhood, a couple blocks of a city, and that's what they would police, and they'd do it on foot. So any crime that happens, then they're on the scene quicker than responsive policing, which is responsive policing is where they patrol very large areas in patrol cars in units of two, and they respond to calls directed from 911 and the central policing communication headquarters, which is of course slower than if there's a police officer already on location. Secondly, if it's a community police officer, he will know pretty much everyone in his neighborhood, which reduces the escalation towards violence, because if you know someone, and he knows you, it's not a stranger you're aiming a gun at. It's not it's the perpetrator. The police officer is also not a stranger to you. It's that, oh, that's the guy I grew up with when I was a kid, and I'm not going to want to commit violence against him. So that reduces the amount of violence that will occur simply through familiarity, unless it's of course violent crime coming from other neighborhoods, in which case you get things like response units, SWAT teams, and so on for bigger issues. But most crime is opportunistic. Most crime is done very locally. Organized crime is not an issue that you can solve with a community officer, but community officer will be a better system for neighborhood policing, for most small crimes, small property crimes, small violent crime. And that model has changed for a large part because of the trends in urbanization. In Europe, we still have more concentrated cities than in America, and in all things, American problems are more accentuated. But it's valuable to look at American trends, because American trends are fairly predictive for what happens in Europe. So in Europe, we're also trending towards developing more suburbs, vertical scaling in central cities and so on. And all of that makes it more difficult to do community policing, because areas are more spread out. Some areas are very, very high density in population, some very large with lower population density, which makes community policing harder. Therefore, traditional urbanism was better in that sort of policing role. So all things, everything's synergetic. So if you're a community, what do they call it, gemeente, a municipal officer, if you're a mayor or something, developing a town, urbanism and policing are things that tie very closely together, and you should look at. So these things are still possible to revert in Europe, but again, in all things, the trend isn't that way. The trend is towards the American model. The American model has to do with urbanism, it has to do with ethnic differences, but it is particular to America is also this trend of militarization, where a lot of former military officers go into the police, and there's a sense that they are not civilians, that they're not part of the general population, which is something that gets fostered in the military, really. And that's a cultural issue fairly unique to American policing. and it's a problem I don't really see happening in Europe. But I think that all across the West, in a sense of police reform, returning to a community policing rather than response policing model would be productive. Um, and generally, it would, for example, not require you to have armed police, because that's why British police traditionally didn't need firearms as the Billy Club. Partially because the population wouldn't be as heavily armed, although we had pretty free weapons laws in Europe up until the 1960s. I think firearms and sabers were only restricted in the Netherlands in 1920 as a response to several communist revolutions. Before then, you could own a rifle, you could own a saber, you could own a knife, pistols, pretty much anything. And it was really, really restricted in the 1960s. These days, it's very hard to get firearms. I think up until the 1960s, you could still get certain weapons like shotguns, rifles, single-shot rifles fairly easily, and that was all restricted in the 60s. I think it was the Constitutional Amendment of 1983, which is a topic that I should make a video on sometime, because in 1983 a majority leftist parliament completely reformed the constitution, and people always act as if the Dutch constitution, oh, you should obey the constitution, it's objective, and so on. Yeah, well, it was reformed by far leftists to suit their political views, So maybe it deserves some revision and some reconsideration. At any rate, police reform is not a crazy idea. I mean, it's not something that's like in the Netherlands necessary yet, but trends being what they are, it's worth looking at, especially in terms of preventative measures. We are taking steps like arming our BOAs, which are support officers, I guess, who up until now were not allowed to have any form of weapons, but now they are being armed simply because violence against police is escalating. Again, that has an ethnic component to it, which is of course the major problem. But again, all things are synergetic. It's not just migration; it's also the trends in urbanization, the population density, cultural trends. I mean, technology. You can go into your little the idea of Kaczynski. Technology and distances you from nature, distances you from your connection with other people. What's the word for it? Disenfranchises you from your labor and so on. So the disconnect and apathy between people grow. So it becomes a lower and lower barrier to escalate towards violence in a more technologically developed society, which I think is something interesting, because the general trend on all things appears to be towards sort of a cyberpunk future. Because one of the takes I've heard about this whole American thing of defunding to police, which is I found interesting, and I think there's a very big core of truth in this, is that they would remove policing for the common man. You'd basically get you'd have to register a complaint, go through a bureaucratic system to get any crime done, and no one's going to come to actually defend you. But privatized police would still exist. So your Amazons and your big chains would have private security firms to do security for them, to make sure that they're safe. So you'd have elites getting police, lower class getting absolutely nothing to protect them, and it's all up to yourself. And in a country that doesn't have firearms, that means basically lawlessness. And that's pretty much cyberpunk, mega corporations ruling the world, private security for them, no policing on the streets, no rights for the common man. Wealth buys you rights, wealth buys you privileges. Seems to be that's sort of the trend, actually. Cyberpunk's the way of the future, looks like.